Brotherhood prepared a rebellion in secret. On Easter Monday, 1916, the Republicans seized control of buildings in the centre of Dublin and fought to make Ireland completely independent of English rule. They hoped the rest of the country would join them. It did not, and the rebels were quickly surrounded by British troops and pounded by British guns. The insurgents made their last stand in Dublin's General Post Office, and after nearly a week's fighting, they surrendered. But when the government began to execute the captured Republican leaders, many Irish people came to think of them as martyrs and heroes. Even the early release of prisoners like Countess Markovitz, one of the leaders of the Easter Rising, could do little to stop a strong Republican movement from growing. In the general election of December 1918, the first to give all men and some women the vote, most parts of Ireland voted massively for Sinn Féin, the new Republican Party. But they refused to take their seats at Westminster. Instead, they met at Dublin's Mansion House in January 1919 and formed their own assembly, Dáil Éireann, which means the Parliament of Ireland, a parliament which Britain refused to recognise. A year later, the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, offered an alternative, the Government of Ireland Act. 2 Home Rule parliaments, one in Belfast, the other in Dublin. Ulster Protestants agreed, Sinn Féin said no. And when Republicans took up arms again, Lloyd George reinforced the Irish police with British ex-soldiers known as Black and Tans and auxiliaries. He was determined to stem the Republican tide. The Irish Republican Army and British government forces fought with a ruthless cruelty which had not been seen in Ireland for more than 100 years. A treaty signed in December 1921 followed a 6-month ceasefire. A compromise settlement was agreed at number 10 Downing Street. Most of Ireland, to be called the Irish Free State, would become self-governing within the Empire, while the 6 northeastern counties would remain within the United Kingdom, but with its own parliament in Belfast. Michael Collins, who had directed the IRA campaign against the British, felt that by signing the treaty, he had signed his own death warrant. The Irish Free State was still inside the British Empire, and many who had fought to get an Irish republic would refuse to accept it. The treaty fell far short of their demands. With a heavy heart, the delegation returned to Dublin to be met with the unbending opposition of Eamon de Valera, the president of the Dáil, and many others. It was not the division of Ireland, but the fact that the Irish Free State would still be part of the British Empire, which was the major sticking point. The Dáil approved the treaty, but by a perilously narrow margin. In less than 6 months, a civil war had begun between those who supported the treaty with Britain and those Republicans who were against it. When the Republicans seized the Dublin forecourts, the Irish Free State Army pounded the building with field guns borrowed from the British. After a few days, the Republicans were forced to surrender. But fierce fighting continued, and now nationalist fought nationalist. Finally, in May 1923, after perhaps 4,000 had died, the Republicans laid down their arms. When King George V disembarked in Belfast to open the first Northern Ireland Parliament in June 1921, he was given a warm welcome by the Loyalists of Ulster. The British government had not forced them under the rule of Dublin after all. Catholics, for their part, had little to cheer about. Making up 1/3 of the inhabitants of Northern Ireland, they had no wish to be ruled from Belfast and resented being left to the mercy of a guaranteed Unionist majority. Catholic MPs refused to attend the royal opening. In his address to the Unionist MPs in Belfast City Hall, King George appealed to all Irishmen to forgive and forget, and he hoped that his coming to Ireland would be the first step towards an end of strife among her people. The Parliament he was opening was to be described later by Northern Ireland's first Prime Minister, James Craig, as a Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people. And with Catholic representatives refusing to take their seats, and Catholics in general refusing to cooperate with the new institutions of the state, that was effectively what it was. The struggle against Dublin rule had been successful, and the Union Jack was still proudly paraded in Ulster. But the price of freedom was constant vigilance. With bitter fighting continuing between Protestant and Catholic, the Unionist government recognized that strong measures would still be needed in Ulster's defense. They voted themselves special powers to deal with possible Catholic rebellion. Suspects could be locked up without trial. Internment camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed police began to fill up with those suspected of organizing against the state. Behind the wire, conditions were very similar to wartime prison camps. Outside, sectarian murders reached a peak in the first 6 months of 1922. 236 people died. In April, the Royal Ulster Constabulary was formed as an armed police force. 1/3 of the places were reserved for Catholics, but they were often reluctant or afraid to join. The British government approved a large expansion of the force to deal with the threat from the IRA. The majority of members were part-timers, serving in the Special Constabulary, an exclusively Protestant force. Sir Basil Brooke, a future Prime Minister, commanded the Specials in his home county of Fermanagh.
They were a Protestant force because the Protestants, taking them by and large, were Queen's men. The Roman Catholics, take them by and large, were for an Irish Republic. Well, now, it'd be very much like having a German in your army as one of your troop leaders. You couldn't have it.
In Belfast, tensions were running high. For over a century, Catholics and Protestants living in their own areas had clashed with one another again and again. With Protestant political power now firmly rooted, Catholics felt completely isolated. 1/3 of the population felt abandoned by their friends at Westminster and in Dublin, left to the mercy of their loyalist neighbours. To the Protestants, Catholics represented a potential threat to the security of Northern Ireland. Those fears and suspicions were soon passed on to succeeding generations. The city was already highly polarized, with the Catholics living in separate communities. Mixing in housing, schooling, marriage or sport was not encouraged by either side, and where it had taken place, the tensions led to many being forced out of their homes. Evictions and burnings led to even greater community divisions. For several centuries, all of Ireland had been under British rule. Now the country was divided, Protestants in control of the north, Catholics in the south. Between them, a border. An invisible line snaking through the countryside, dividing villages, farms, and even houses. The report of a boundary commission appointed in 1924 to review its location was never published, and Catholic hopes that territory would be handed over to the Free State were dashed. Hope, too, that Northern Ireland would collapse from within evaporated as the original frontier was confirmed. From both sides, armed police and troops stared at one another, wondering what the future would bring. There was a feeling of unfinished business. Both new states on the island had been born in violence or the threat of violence, and the compromise of partition in haste was fatally flawed. But for the moment, the Irish question was off the British political agenda. Any fresh attempt to come to terms with it properly would have to wait for another 50 years.